On the first Tuesday every November, Australia stops for a horse race. The horse race, the Melbourne Cup at Flemington. But why? Why is the Melbourne Cup so incredibly popular? How does one horse race come to become a public holiday in its city? And what's it like being the person who 700 million people around the world listen to for 3 minutes every year?
I'm Matt Hill, and this is The Knowledge.
Matt Hale is Melbourne's official race caller. Wherever you're watching the Melbourne Cup, you can bet it's his voice you're listening to. A born and bred genuine Melburnian who grew up on Flemington Park's doorstep, he spent a lifetime following the race that stops a nation. He's also called Grand Nationals in England, Australian Open tennis matches, and gold medal winning performances at the Olympic Games. But everything always comes back to Melbourne and the Melbourne Cup.
I'm born in the western suburbs of Melbourne, so I was actually born in a town called Williamstown, which is about 15 minutes from Flemington Racecourse, so I'm on the right side of town there. And my early days were going to Flemington with my grandfather or going to the football with my grandma, and I used to sit in the grandstand at Flemington and just marvel at it's one of the world's great racecourses, and Flemington Racecourse itself has 3 massive grandstands, but the public stand, which anyone's allowed to sit in, is one of the highest in the country, in the world, and sits right over the winning post. So the actual members that pay a lot of money to be in the members stand or the club stand, they're about 300 metres from the winning post. So it was a great place to, I would probably call it misspent youth, but I really loved it. And it was just the sound of the commentator over the public address system that really made me think about being a race commentator. I loved the fact that every time he said something, the crowd reacted. And Flemington was a place that was very special. And every time I walk into Flemington, it's always a special experience.
And you call it misspent youth, but it obviously isn't, because it led you to have a fabulous career. I'm wondering if, in fact, everything you did in the build-up to your first Melbourne Cup call perhaps was just leading up to that. Was that always your aim to call the Melbourne Cup one day?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think every race caller, in particular from Melbourne, wants to call the Melbourne Cup. You're quite right. I think every time you put your bag in the back of the car at the end of a long day at a country racetrack somewhere, or you've had a long day in the hot weather at another race course, you think to yourself, gee, well, maybe it'd be worth it one day to call a Melbourne Cup. And in reality, in Australia, there's not that many race callers that have called Melbourne Cups. I mean, if we got them that were alive today at a luncheon, I think there'd only be about 10 or 11 guys that have called Melbourne Cups in the past. So I think there's been more astronauts to space than Melbourne Cup callers, so they're rare. And, it's a privilege to be a part of the chosen few. But no doubt, I think on Melbourne Cup morning, I was a bit 50-50. There was 50% of me that was proud and excited to be there, and then another 50% that knew I had a job to do, and I was there for a reason, and try and block out all of the hype and concentrate and call the winner home.
Stand by, and they're racing in the Melbourne Cup. Humidor jumped away only.
Matt's first Melbourne Cup call was in 2017, when Joseph O'Brien's Rekindling stormed to victory under Corey Brown. That was the 157th running of the Cup, which of course turns 159 this year. Yes, that doesn't match the Grand National's 180 years, but it does better than Kentucky Derby's 144. And in fact, it's almost as old as the nation it stops. There's a clue there as to where its immense draw comes from.
It's a bit of a tradition, the Melbourne Cup, and I think we're desperate for traditions in Australia because we're a very young country. And it's been the race that stops a nation for 150 years now. And we're not a very old country at all, just over 200 years old. So it's a public holiday in Melbourne. So I think that helps in that it doesn't matter what profession you have, you're having a day off because of a horse race. So it's very easy to be knowledgeable of it to start with. But it's just become an event, and Melbourne in particular is a city in Australia that does events very well, and it's in the culture of Melburnians to rock up to things that are on, even if they don't really like them. For instance, the Australian Open tennis in January, a lot of people will go to the Australian Open tennis and spend a lot of time on Grand Slam Oval, maybe having a champagne or two, and they might not even see a tennis ball hit. The same could be said about the Melbourne Cup. They'll get 110,000 people to the track, and I'd hasten to say probably 50,000 of them don't really care about the horses going around, but it's a part of the event. It is a part of the media landscape for a couple of weeks in newspapers and on the TV news, and there's just so much hype around it, and it's very easy to get caught up in it and have an interest on the day, and there'll be 24 runners in the Melbourne Cup, and every single horse has got their supporters.
And when you're in this build-up zone to the Melbourne Cup, is the news transcending? Like, is it making the front pages and things like that?
Absolutely. And what tends to happen is there's different parts of the Melbourne Cup Carnival that make the newspapers for different reasons. So as far as the Melbourne Cup horse race is concerned, the international runners coming a month before, they land on our grand final day, our Australian Rules Football grand final day. And from that point, about a month or two out before the Cup, they're talked about in the back page of the paper. And then you've got on the front pages of the papers, you've got the fashion, and you've got the ambassadors, and what colours should be worn on Melbourne Cup Day, etc., and what celebrities are going to the marquees, which has become such a big part of Melbourne Cup time. There's Marquee City at about the 400-metre mark, where all of the major sponsors have these elaborate tents that it's just extraordinary what you can go into nowadays. And so they make the papers as well, and it's a great part of the year in Melbourne, because the landscape as far as sports news goes to horse racing, because there's no Australian Rules football left to cover. The rugby league is over as well, and the summer sports haven't really kicked in yet, like the Australian soccer or football, as you'd call it over there, and the cricket hasn't started, or the tennis. So there's that lovely little 4 or 5 week passage where horse racing is the main sport in town. It's the main sport in the country at the moment as we speak.
We've already mentioned the similar heritage of the Grand National and the Kentucky Derby, which are the only other horse races in the world that command as much respect as the Melbourne Cup. These are the races that people who don't know anything about horse racing know about. It's the one race they watch every year, and Matt Hale has been lucky enough to be part of many Grand National commentary teams. Did that experience help him when he stepped up to call his first Melbourne Cup?
No doubt. In fact, one of the rare things about my first Melbourne Cup was a prominent owner here in Australia, a Leviathan owner by the name of Lloyd Williams, had 6 runners in the race, and his colours are navy blue with white armbands, and he usually has a white cap on his horses, and because he had 6 different, same colours, but 6 different coloured caps, and everyone was saying to me, how are you going to deal with that? That must be really hard. But of course, J.P. McManus, the famous owner of jumps horses in England, had many runners in Grand Nationals. I think one of the years, it might have even been the first year I called a Grand National from Beecher's book, I think J.P. McManus had 6 or 7 runners. So there was certainly it's a lot of tools that I'd learnt on the journeys. But I just love the vibe of Aintree. For me, just that magnificent way that the horses leave the main course and head over the Melling Road into the country and jump these enormous fences. There's a lot of mystique to Aintree, unlike any other race course in the world. And what makes the Grand National too is that it's at Aintree, a little town outside of Liverpool in the unfashionable part of Great Britain, and it's just a magic part of the world to be in, and it wouldn't be the Grand National if it wasn't in that part of the world either.
Yeah, and going back to that first Melbourne Cup call, do you remember getting the call to make the call?
Well, it's funny because I remember getting the job, and when I got the job of being the main Melbourne race caller, obviously packaged in that is the Melbourne Cup. So yeah, the first thing that came to mind straight away was I'll be calling the Melbourne Cup, which is special, and I think it's the one thing that gets packaged in the job that makes it all worth it. And look, we go to many race meetings during the year, and the jockeys and the trainers do as well, that you would call a bit humdrum. You know, you go to a race meeting in the country and there's 8 or 9 races and all of the horses are pretty slow and you think no one's listening. But at the end of the day, you're just ticking over because the first Tuesday in November is the day that you get to call the great race. So, yeah, I do remember getting the call. In fact, I got an email. I was in Great Britain at the time going to the Cheltenham Festival. I was in a little hotel room in Cheltenham and I got an email at 2 a.m. in the morning from Racing Victoria saying that I'd got the job. So I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I was that excited, and now we're heading towards my 3rd Melbourne Cup. So time goes fast when you're having fun, Jess.
With 24 runners in the Melbourne Cup and many unfamiliar international runners, preparation for calling the race starts weeks in advance, almost as soon as the first international runners land at the Werribee Equine Centre.
With the influx of the international horses, we have to keep a really close eye on what's going on. We won't get the field for the Melbourne Cup until the Saturday night before it. So I've probably got 60 hours from when the field comes out to when the race is on. I would have seen a few of them before, but I like to get the field in place on the Sunday morning, and it's a little bit like a school exam, even though I've seen the horses before, or some of the international horses I might have seen on video, and YouTube and Twitter have made it a lot easier to do things like that now. Look at the horses from overseas. But I like to get the field out and just really just go back to learning the colours. My absolute role is to call the horses in order above anything else. So I tend to just try and concentrate on that, keep it pretty simple, but try and learn those colours as well as I can. And by the time you get to Melbourne Cup Day, the race goes for 3 minutes. The record for the Melbourne Cup is 3 minutes 16 seconds. So it goes for about 3.5 minutes. I find that race calling is a concentration game, Jess. So you tend to have to really bunker down whilst a race is on and forget about the world around you or anything else that's going on. And the Melbourne Cup, because it's such an important race and so many people are listening, you concentrate so much more. You put yourself into almost a trance. And the first Melbourne Cup I called, I don't think I can even remember a lot of it because I was just concentrating that hard. I reckon someone would have been hitting me over the back of the head with a baseball bat and I would never have known.
Race commentating is an art, a very special skill, made harder on days when 700 million people might just be listening to you. But even without that pressure, Flemington throws up unique problems.
The biggest issue we have with the Melbourne Cup calling-wise is seeing them. The biggest thing is seeing the horses properly. The track is so big and we predominantly use binoculars. We've got TV monitors which help. When you've got 24 in a pack, you need to be able to see the colours clearly, and that's one stress that can really hit you at about the 800-metre mark. They pack around the home turn and the whips are cracking and the jockeys are getting motivated and the race is on, and as the caller you're trying to see as much as you possibly can. So yeah, I think you've got to keep a very clear mind. You've got to basically go in with a fresh mind if you can, and just have 3 minutes and give it all you've got.
The Melbourne Cup is without question the biggest show in town, but it's not the only show. And in fact, for as long as she raced, the record-breaking mare Winx took top billing. She transcended racing, entering the hearts of a nation like only a few before her had ever achieved. Farlap, Maccabee Diva, Black Caviar and now Winx, true everlasting legends of Australian sporting history. From the commentary box, Winx was as transfixing as she was to the legions of fans in the crowd below. Her incredible performances and record-winning streak of 33 wins actually changed the way race callers had to work. It wasn't about calling the action anymore. When Winx was on the track, the script was already written.
And Royal Symphony, so with 600 to go, Galo Chopper in front, but here comes Winx on the outside, sliding up now. We've waited 35 years for this, and Winx moves up to Galo Chop, followed further back by Folkeswood.
The hardest part for me as the race caller was her races weren't really races. They became events that she was expected to win, and most of the time she was going to win. So it became more of almost became more theatre than actually a sports commentary, and that made it tricky because at the end race callers aren't poets. We're there to broadcast a race accurately, and when she was destroying them all the time, it became about what race caller could say the best line. So But I got a bit lucky in a couple of her races. She ran in a Turnbull Stakes here at Flemington, and she wasn't well ridden. She was well back in the field, and she got caught up in traffic, and she was able to win on the line. So I had to go back into race caller mode for that. But also her third Cox Plate, when a horse called Humidor sort of jumped out of the clouds and surprised everybody and chased her up the straight. There wasn't much time for theatre then. In fact, everybody was in shock because she almost got rolled. So I think, to be honest, if Winx didn't retire, her owners would have had nervous breakdowns by now. I think they couldn't handle the pressure. I know that one of her owners, Debbie Capitas, she just broke down in tears 10 minutes before her fourth Cox Plate because she just couldn't handle the pressure. So it just continued to build and build for everybody. But I guess what you were saying earlier is so true. I went to those country race meetings as a child, wanting to be a race caller, doing the hard yards to call moments like that. And it's moments like that that make race callers, because they'll replay those races for 100 years down the track. They'll talk about Winx, so fondly in 100 years' time, and those race calls will be with them. So overall, yes, it was pressure, but it's a privilege above all.
And who do you think won the battle then for the best Winx line?
Well, it's an interesting one. I don't know. Well, I didn't get much of a chance. I had 4 cracks at her. Darren Flindell in Sydney had plenty of opportunities because she won a lot of her races up there. And Greg Miles, my predecessor, called her so well in her first and second Cox Plates. One call that seemed to resonate with everybody was her second race win in the Cox Plate when she destroyed them, and Greg said it's a Winx blitz, and that seemed to get replayed a lot. I think that was one of the better lines, which was pretty much off the cuff, and that's the tricky part, Jess. You do have the lines rehearsed, but you have to make them sound like you've just spat them out and just thought about them. So there's a bit of an art form to that, but I think most people would know that we have to rehearse them, otherwise they wouldn't come out properly. I've got to tell you, with Winx's third and fourth Cox Plates, and I don't like calling races like this, but I had nearly every word worked out to some extent. So, which you don't want to do because you don't want to preempt races, especially as a race caller. But I had to do it for her. So maybe that answers the question. Maybe that's how special she was, that we had to change almost the way we did our profession for her. You could almost predict what was going to happen, which I wish we could do for a Melbourne Cup, because that's impossible to do.
It's impossible, but then again, there have been multiple winners, and something that Winx never did, of course, was win or run in the Melbourne Cup. It's not her scene, but Maccabee Diva was the last great mare of that race, and I'm sure you have great memories of her too. Definitely.
I mean, Maccabee Diva was a horse that she was a horse that was put together by a big group of owners, and the actual name was put together by the initials of some of the owners. And she took Australia by storm, and the one way to do that is to win the Melbourne Cup multiple times, which has been done previously. But to win 3 is astounding, and especially because the Melbourne Cup is a handicap. So obviously, the more you win, the more weight you're going to carry. So she had to lump a fair bit of weight in that third Melbourne Cup. But strangely, if you watch that third Melbourne Cup back, she was never really going to lose. She was in the perfect position. Glenn Boss, her rider, wouldn't be called as the most technically brilliant rider, but he's just so tactically very good. And when he rides a good race on them, he's spectacular. And he gave her 3 magnificent rides, and she goes down, in folklore as probably better than Winx, I'd suggest. To win 3 Melbourne Cups, that's unheard of. And I think we tend to forget horses very quickly when a new champion comes along. There's no doubt Winx was outstanding, but to do what Maccabee Diva did, we'll never see it again. Actually, Lee Friedman, her trainer, said that day to the media, get a small child at Flemington today and you can tell them they'll never see that again. So it was a pretty special day.
Then Maccabee Diva, who's on the rails now. Great piece of riding by Boss as they lead the straight to the 2,000. 500 left to go, coming around the home turn. As they come down the straight was Vinnie Rowe, and back behind them, here's Maccabee Diva. A nation roars for a hero. She's starting to wind up. 300 left to go now. Maccabee Diva's racing up. Envoy's trying to go with her. They've got to Portland Singer and Lachlan River. Here comes Like a Falcon and excellent. But Maccabee Diva clear with 100 metres to go. Excellent runs to second. Onazurn runs on. But a champion becomes a legend.
The second Melbourne Cup, I think, was one of the best Melbourne Cups we've ever seen because she had to beat Vinnie Rowe, who was the English champion stayer as well, and it was a wet day, so it really suited him. So for her to beat him under those conditions was absolutely superb. She did win races at shorter trips, but she was probably the last of the Australian horses that was adaptable to win those kinds of races. The thing is, nowadays, we don't breed horses to win Melbourne Cups. We breed them to win sprint races. So that makes it difficult to win Melbourne Cups for our breeding industry, and that's why the internationals go so well. But she was the first to win our big mile races. Well, initially, she was actually foaled in the United Kingdom, something a lot of people don't know. But, you know, she was able to win races early on in her life as a sprinter, and then moved on to winning races such as the Cox Plate at 10 furlongs and also the Caulfield Cup at 1.5 miles. So she was something else. She became probably one of our greatest racehorses, right up there with Farlap, and you could probably put Winx in that category.
Let's go back to that point Matt made about breeding. Australians tend to breed more sprinters than stayers these days, so it's become harder and harder for them to win the Melbourne Cup. For the last 2 years, it's been won by a Northern Hemisphere trained 3-year-old, and Matt doesn't see an end to this domination by international runners, despite the challenges associated with travelling across the world.
It's always a challenge. Some horses, like humans, would handle it better than others. But overall, it seems to me that the cream rise to the top. But we've got an interesting year this year because we've got a couple of Japanese horses that are here that are top-grade Japanese horses as opposed to the Japanese we've had previously, which have probably been their 4th or 5th stringers. And you have to also have a particular type of horse to win a Melbourne Cup. The last 2 years, the Cup has evolved so much with Cross Counter and Rekindling, both being Northern Hemisphere 3-year-olds. So they've found the horse, the type of horse that can win a quick 2 miles around Flemington. The Brits initially brought horses such as Oscar Schindler and Drum Taps, who was the great stayers from England and Ireland. And, you know, at the time when Oscar Schindler came over, they said he was the greatest stayer that we'll ever see, and he ran down the track in the Melbourne Cup. So the horses that tend to be the best 1.5 mile type horses, they come to Melbourne and perform better than say the Ascot Gold Cup winner or the Goodwood Gold Cup winner.
That's the trend now, you're saying, is it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. You don't want a 4,000 metre horse or a 2.5 miler. You want a 1.5 mile horse. And we had a horse come over early in the 2000s, 2001, Give the Slip. It was a pacemaker for Godolphin. Had spent most of its life in England running over 1.5 miles, setting the pace for their more fancied horses. And he came to Melbourne and nearly won the Melbourne Cup at 50-1. By just being a front runner and being a quick 1.5 mile horse. So, and the other thing about Flemington and the Melbourne Cup is they race very tightly. 24 runners in a 2 mile race. They do race very close together. Australian racing tends to race a bit closer than what the English and the Irish would. So, as a result, some horses just can't handle the challenge of being cluttered up. They like those big, roomy tracks of like the Curragh or Royal Ascot. So that's also a challenge for the horses. It's just a different environment for them.
There's no best stall to be starting in, even though it is a big field. But from Matt's view in the commentary box, there is one key trait he can see that a horse must have to be a Melbourne Cup winner.
You know, I reckon there's some keys to the Melbourne Cup. There's a horse over here at the moment called Constantinople, who ran in the Great Voltager at York. And to me, it seems like a horse that's got the right form lines. It's a Northern Hemisphere 3-year-old. So it ticks a lot of boxes, but it doesn't settle. It's a bit of a hothead. And I think in a Melbourne Cup, you need to be able to settle. That is a massive key to it, and then work into the race on the home turn. And if your horse gets a little bit spooked by the crowd or stirred up, there's 110,000 people at the track. And as I mentioned before, a lot of them are very hyped up. and that can hype the horses up as well. And when you've got 24 runners in a mounting yard packed full of owners, there's a lot going on Melbourne Cup Day. They'll have entertainment 30 minutes before with a band and things like that. So they have to be settled, and I just worry about Constantinople in that environment, because he does look like a horse that tends to over-race at times. So that's a real key. As far as the draw goes, to answer the question, yeah, it's important, but it all certainly depends on. I think you could probably sit 3 wide in a Melbourne Cup as long as you drop your head and you travel well in the run.
And you mentioned Constantinople, who is in the top 5 in the betting and is quite fancied. But the 2 favourites, Finch and Surprise Baby, what do you make of their chances?
Well, Surprise Baby is a fascinating horse, Jess, because it's trained in Victoria, in Melbourne, by a man by the name of Paul Prushko, who comes from a small town named Horsham, which is about 3 hours out of Melbourne. And Surprise Baby won the Adelaide Cup, which is over 2 miles, but it's not a race now that it is fashionable for Melbourne Cup horses. But what they've decided to do, because there's so many internationals winning our race now, they've put on a couple of Australian races during the year to qualify for the Melbourne Cup, to make sure that Australians run in the Melbourne Cup. And Surprise Baby ran in the qualifying race in May and got beaten the nose. And he had to qualify, and he qualified last week at Flemington and won very impressively over 1.5 miles. And he's now into equal favourite, as you mentioned, and he's got a great turn of foot on him. He's a very impressive horse. He'll settle in the back half, but that won't matter because the pace will be on in a Melbourne Cup. Is he up to the class? We think he is. He only won the Adelaide Cup at his 6th race start, so that's a big achievement for a young horse to do that over 2 miles. So he can certainly stay the distance. He's got a great turn of foot, as I mentioned. So I think Surprise Baby's up to it. Finch is a fascinating runner. He's a lovely horse. He's got a magnificent stride. He bangs the ground quite heavily. He runs like a giraffe. He's a big, gangly sort of a horse, but he ran really well in the Geelong Cup last year and then went to Flemington and ran a great race at a big price in the Melbourne Cup. So it's interesting that he's been here, seen it all before, won very impressively in Sydney, and then was great the other day in a Group 1 race over 10 furlongs. So he's primed, he's ready. He's got the champion trainer, Winx's trainer, Chris Waller, training him. So, yeah, he's got to be a chance as well. This is the problem now when we're 3 or 4 weeks in the Melbourne Cup. There's about 5 or 6 horses and you can't back them all.
No, you can't back them all, but there are those with better chances than others. Those 2 favourites, Finch and Surprise Baby, certainly have Matt's support. And how can we forget last year's winner, Cross Counter, who's also back?
Well, he was fantastic. I mean, what he did, if you watch the replay, Jess, I think he was something like 18th at about the 400-metre mark. So his run was phenomenal. And Godolphin were always promising to win it, and they finally won one. But he's a very good horse, and he's gone back to England this year and performed so well behind Stradivarius in races like the Ascot Gold Cup. So a horse like Cross Counter, he's got to be in there again. The handicap has given him an extra few kilos for his efforts last year, but rightly so. Look, he's got to be in there. He's ticking over really well. But the thing is that takes my attention away from Cross Counter is the fact that the last 2 winners of the Cup have seemingly come from nowhere. The Caulfield Cup was always the great guide, and seemingly that's been completely, shot out of the sky now with these horses that appear at the last moment and sneak into the Cup and win it. So we're going to have to keep a very close eye on some of these international horses that we haven't seen much of.
How do you do in predicting Melbourne Cup winners? Like, who was your pick last year?
I don't think I've got a very good record. I think last year I was all over Yucatan, the horse that was so dominant at Caulfield, won like Farlap, and then didn't perform. And he's in the mix this year, but he hasn't been going that well. He's been having a few pipe opener runs, but they haven't put blinkers on him yet, which is interesting. But he might be a one to watch at a big price for the Melbourne Cup, Yucatan. But I was all over him last year, and I think he would probably go down for me as the disappointment of the Spring Carnival 12 months ago. He promised so much, and when he won at Caulfield, everybody was absolutely bowled away and thought this horse is just a champion, but unfortunately he didn't go on with it.
You mentioned that one of Maccabee Diva's wins might have been the best Melbourne Cup in your view, but is that, in fact, the best Melbourne Cup that you've seen, or is there a better one?
Well, I think with of class of horse, the finish of that Maccabee Diva's second Melbourne Cup was right up there. As far as great Melbourne Cups, I think there's been plenty. There's been plenty of spectacular finishes and memorable ones. Media Puzzle was a very memorable win because Damien Oliver was riding and he'd lost his brother in a track fall during the week leading up to the Melbourne Cup. So that was a very emotional Melbourne Cup win. In fact, so much so they made a movie over it. And Michelle Payne, who was the first woman jockey to win the Melbourne Cup on Prince of Penzance in 2015, and they've just made a movie on her. So there's been some spectacular cups, but I reckon in my lifetime the best Melbourne Cup, that's a great question. I reckon Might and Power beating Doremus in the Melbourne Cup in 1997 was just about the best we've seen. Doremus was a previous Cup winner. Might and Power was one of our great horses who'd won the Caulfield Cup by 7 lengths, came out and virtually led all of the way in the Melbourne Cup, won by a nose in a very close finish, but it's very hard to lead all the way in a Melbourne Cup. It's barely been done before. He was a super horse. It was a dramatic finish. Greg Hall on Doremus thought he'd won. He whip-flourished. He whip-flourished the crowd and thought he'd won the race, only to be told about a minute later that he'd got beaten in the photo. So the great thing about these races, we talked about the Grand National before, and the Melbourne Cup's the same. There's always a story connected, not just with the horse, but the jockey and the trainer as well, and perhaps the owner. So it's usually a fairy tale every 12 months.
I think you're right, and I think the reason that those two races have such a connection to stories is because it's such a long journey to get there, and things happen, and you have to make sacrifices, and you have to achieve the impossible just to get there. That for me is why that works with the Grand National for sure. Anyway, and anybody, because it's a handicap, anybody can be in it.
That's exactly right, and that is the great thing of the Melbourne Cup, is it was always designed to be the people's race, the battler's race. It's not so much like that now, but it's still a handicap. So there's a lot of there's a lot of tricking of the handicapper, if you could put it that way, to be done, and a lot of gamesmanship along the way, and there's always a lot of talk, especially when the internationals arrive for the month leading up. A lot of whispers around who's been performing better than who on the race course. There's just a lot of talk and chatter, and that's why the build-up is so good. And I think with the Melbourne Cup, to be honest, as the race caller, by the time we get to 3 o'clock on the first Tuesday in November, you just want the answer, because we've been talking about it for such a long time now.
It sounds to me, actually, we were talking about it being the people's race, but it sounds to me like Surprise Baby might be the people's winner this year if Surprise Baby was to do it.
I think Surprise Baby he'd certainly be the people's winner. Paul Prushka, as I mentioned, a small-time trainer at Horsham. You've got Jordan Childs, who's a young rider, wouldn't be in our top 10, but he's a very competent rider. He's trying to make the weight of 53.5 kilos to ride in the Melbourne Cup. He wouldn't get another opportunity, I don't think. So, yeah, definitely. And when he won the qualifying race at Flemington last week, the crowd cheered him home. He put that wrong right after just being beaten in the qualifying race in May. So there's been a lot of theatre around Surprise Baby, and it's not because Australians are being parochial about him. He can actually win it. He has got that ability. The thing that will beat him is that unknown quantity of which international horses could topple him. And the thing is with the Melbourne Cup, you mentioned the handicap. What's interesting about that is you'll never get the absolute top brass stayer from England for the Melbourne Cup because it's a handicap. They get too much weight. So a horse like Stradivarius, for instance, would go very well in a Melbourne Cup, but the problem is he'd get weighted out of it. So the international horses that come aren't your absolute top brass. So they're beatable. Being a handicap, it makes it fairer for all. So in that respect, that's why a Surprise Baby is sitting up there with a Finch as equal favourites for the Melbourne Cup. That's the uniqueness of it.
Alongside positive press is always negative press, and generally that's what garners the most attention. An event as monumental as the Melbourne Cup has the power to get everyone's attention, so it's no surprise when people use it to try to push their own agenda. This year, climate change protesters have descended on Melbourne right in the thick of Cup mania, and animal activists have too. Their message, slamming the race for having lost a horse to a fatal injury last year, was so strong it caused pop singer Taylor Swift to cancel her planned performance at the race meeting. That's not the official reason given for her cancellation, but having made the decision after the process went viral, it's hard to believe there was any other reason. What I want to know is what people in Melbourne think about her move, and whether these protests are common.
The protesters certainly aren't seen very often. You might see them at a jumps race meeting in Australia or in Melbourne maybe twice a year. But as far as the Melbourne Cup is concerned, over the years they've used the Melbourne Cup maybe to protest against other things, mainly because it's a great platform. It's the race that stops the nation, so everybody's watching it. So it's a great way of getting your message across if you want to, I suppose. But it's not unlike, the protesters that are holding up Melbourne at the moment about climate change. It's just a platform. It's a way to do it. We were all very excited by the fact that Taylor Swift was coming. Makes it even a bigger event than it was. And to be honest, what we believe is that the activists or her fans, more to the point, have basically coerced her into not coming. The line from the Victoria Racing Club, and they can only announce what they were told initially, was that she had touring commitments elsewhere and was unavailable to go to Flemington. I mean, reading between the lines, it may suggest that the crew behind Taylor Swift thought it would be a great idea. It would have been sold to them that the Melbourne Cup's a big event and there's a lot of publicity and a big crowd at the track with 100,000 people, and they thought, what a great idea. And then once they may not have done their due diligence, who knows? And then the Taylor Swift fans have come out and basically told her that a horse died in it last year and that she shouldn't be doing it. So that's up to Taylor Swift. I mean, the protesters are allowed to have a voice, even though they're probably ignorant in many respects. But it's a part of the sport we have now, Jess. It's the modern world. There are people out there that don't like horse racing, that despise horse racing. And that's all fine. I think what the racing industry needs to do is understand that and work with it, whatever way that is. But I mean, the whip issue, who knows, 10 years' time, probably jockeys won't carry whips in Melbourne Cups, mainly because of perception. But that's the world we live in, and, things don't change for the better, they don't change for the worse, they just change, and racing has to adapt with that.
Hot on the heels of Taylor Swift's cancellation came the news that Melbourne Cup winning trainer Darren Weir had been charged with animal cruelty. It can be looked at as tarnishing the industry further in what should be its greatest hour, but in fact, Matt sees this news as immensely positive.
The thing is with the Darren Weir situation, it's just an extraordinary story. If you like following a person's story, he was, a guy from the bush who built up an immaculate stable of horses that were winning everything. There would be race meetings back 3 or 4 years ago that Darren Weir had trained 4 or 5 winners a meeting. He was unstoppable, and he's had a massive fall from grace. Suspended from the sport initially by Racing Victoria for 4 years, and the Victorian police have also been involved, and he's now charged on 9 counts of animal cruelty. And there's a lot deeper things to be found in those charges as well. So he's in a lot of trouble, and I think we're all very accepting of the fact that in any sport, people are trying to find an edge. We've seen it in athletics and swimming and all other sports as well. There's people trying to find an edge all of the time. But when it comes to animal cruelty, that is a different case altogether. And I don't think you'll find many horse racing people, Jess, that don't like animals. They adore animals. And the trainers of racehorses are the same. They treat horses better than they treat their own kids. So it isn't acceptable, and it's a shame. But what I would say is that it's a positive in that I think cleaning this stuff out is very good. I would hate to think that it was happening for a long time and no one was doing anything about it. So that is a positive. I know it makes the sport look terrible, especially at our premium time of year when we're in the news every day, and we'd prefer to have these news stories not in the newspapers, but unfortunately they do. They made the front page of the Herald Sun in Melbourne today. But I am certainly buoyed by the fact that there's cleaning up that's happening, and there's probably more to be done. But at the same time, I'm happy that is happening, because I'd hate to think that it's been happening for so long and nothing's been done.
For me, it seems positive too that someone of Darren Weir's standing, a Melbourne Cup winning trainer, is not immune to being investigated.
It's a great point, because I think that's the other scary thing, is if authorities don't want to do anything because of someone's profile or their success, that becomes very cloudy indeed, and obviously a lot of resentment then follows from other participants. So I couldn't agree more. He's one of a band of merry men that are unfortunately charged with what's gone on over the last few years. So there's a lot more to play out. It's just unfortunate, the timing. But, yeah, you're quite right. He was at the absolute top of his game. In fact, looking at some previous results today of some of the feature races coming up, Darren Weir won plenty of them, and he would have horses go around on most racetracks in Victoria during the week and also in South Australia, and was winning most of them. So he's in a lot of trouble now, and time will tell. I think all of the people involved have to go to the Magistrates Court on October 23, so there's certainly a lot more to play out there, Jess.
There are 159 years of history, tradition and glamour deep within the Golden Melbourne Cup that will be held aloft on the first Tuesday in November. It can tell stories that Hollywood could not dream up, tales of hope and courage that have made several movies already and will make many more to come. When the last horse goes in this year and the crowd quiets, that last hush before the chaos, use that 1 second to reflect on all that has come before. For the Melbourne Cup is only a horse race for 3 minutes. 3 minutes when it belongs to Matt Hale.
You've been listening to the Knowledge Podcast, brought to you by Gambling.com. To hear new episodes as soon as they're released, make sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify and SoundCloud. Simply search for The Knowledge on your preferred platform. Visit Gambling.com/podcast for full access to our extensive podcast library. To keep up to date with all things gambling, make sure to follow Gambling.com on Twitter @gambling_com.